In a luxurious restaurant, where million-dollar decisions are made under low light and gleaming glasses, a simple waitress perceives a detail that no one else sees. Between furtive glances and calculated gestures, she feels that something is deeply wrong, and that danger is closer than it seems. Divided between the fear of getting involved and the urgency to act, she makes a decision that could cost everything, or save a life. But what begins as a silent warning quickly transforms into a twist capable of exposing betrayals, hidden intentions, and a past that was never forgotten. Before discovering how a note of a few words changed two destinies forever, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more surprising stories. O Almanobre was located on the corner of Rua Iguatemi and Avenida Faria Lima, in that stretch where the mirrored glass buildings seemed to compete in height with the pride of the men who circulated inside them. It was a restaurant that didn't need a billboard or an Instagram profile to be known. Those who needed to know knew. Those who didn't know were not the type of client that interested them. The discreet facade, with amber lighting and a polished bronze plaque on the door, said everything without saying anything. It was the type of place where eight-figure deals were celebrated with a glass of wine that cost more than the monthly salary of any of the waiters who served it. Mariana Luz arrived every day at 16 hours, not because her shift required it, but because she needed that time. She needed to walk among the empty tables before the customers arrived to feel the silence of that hall that would soon transform into calculated chatter, into contained laughter, into conversations that were never about what they seemed to be. She had learned to like this ritual over 6 years working at O Almanobre. 6 years serving the same faces, hearing the same stories of power with new details, being looked through by people who saw her only as an extension of the exquisite furniture. Mariana was 32 years old and had a face that people described as pretty in an ordinary way, which was the polite way of saying she was invisible in the type of environment she frequented. Her dark hair was always tied in a low bun during work, and the restaurant's black uniform erased any trace of personality she might carry. That was how she liked it, in fact. Invisible meant free. Free to observe, to listen, to understand the patterns of that world she served, but to which she would never belong. And she observed everything. It was almost a compulsion. The way Mr. Alcantara always ordered the same wine, but pretended to deliberate for 10 minutes to appear sophisticated. The way Table 7 received different men every week, but the conversations always followed the same script of numbers and vague promises. The new waiters who arrived full of ambition and left in 3 months, unable to bear the weight of becoming invisible by choice. Mariana stayed. Mariana observed. On that Thursday in November, the weather in São Paulo was in that annoying end-of-year way, too hot to be tolerable and too dry to be forgettable. O Almanobre's air conditioning worked in absolute silence, like everything there, and the dining room was at 70% occupancy when Mariana started the second service shift at 19 hours. Roberto, the maitre d', had given a quick briefing before the movement began to grow. Table 12 was the priority of the night. There was a reservation in the name of Gustavo Villar. The name did something strange in Mariana's stomach, but she didn't know exactly what to name it. Gustavo Villar was the executive president of Villar Pharma, one of the largest pharmaceutical groups in Brazil, with operations spread across 12 countries and a history of mergers that the business press covered with the same devotion it covered elections. He had appeared on the lists of the most influential men in the country for at least 8 consecutive years. Mariana had served him a few times. He was the type of man who placed orders without looking at who received them and who thanked with a nod that seemed like a favor. At 53 years old, Gustavo Villar had the physique of someone who kept in shape through discipline and not for pleasure. Grey hair cut with surgical precision and dark brown eyes that seemed to calculate everything all the time. He wasn't cold out of malice, Mariana had concluded over time. He was cold by habit. He was the type of person who had learned very early that showing emotion in the environment in which he lived was a weakness that others used against you. Table 12 was on the second level of the hall, slightly away from the others, with a glass wall that looked out onto the illuminated internal garden. It was the preferred table for discreet meetings. Roberto used to call it the table of decisions, and it was no exaggeration. Mariana knew it well. She knew the exact angle of each chair, the distance between the glasses and the center of the table, the way the reflection of the lamps created a soft shadow zone over whoever sat with their back to the garden. Gustavo Villar arrived at 20 hours with a 15-minute delay, which for him was a rarity. Mariana noticed this because she had unintentionally noted the time the other times he had appeared. He came alone and was led to table 12 by Roberto, who made that almost imperceptible bow he reserved only for customers at the top of the list. Villar sat facing the entrance of the hall, which was always the sign of someone who needed to see who was arriving before being seen. Mariana approached with the menu, although she knew he rarely needed to consult it. He received her with a quick look, ordered sparkling water, and said he would wait for his guests before ordering. The voice was the same as she remembered, direct, straightforward, with that controlled modulation of someone who spent years speaking in meeting rooms. She bowed her head slightly and moved away. There was something different about him that night. Mariana couldn't pinpoint what yet, but she had learned to trust this feeling. It was like when you enter a room and know, before seeing anything concrete, that something has moved out of place. An almost imperceptible tension in the jaw, fingers that tapped once on the edge of the table before stopping abruptly, as if he had reprimanded himself for the gesture. Gustavo Villar was waiting for something that didn't leave him completely at ease. The guests arrived at 20:20, 2 men. Mariana saw them cross the hall toward table 12, and something in her perception, sharpened by years of observation in that environment, took a leap. It was nothing she could describe with immediate words. It was a quality in the way they moved, too elegant on the surface, but with a rigidity in their shoulders that didn't match the ease they tried to project. Well-cut suits, business posture, calibrated smiles, everything in place, everything a bit too calculated. She filled Villar's water glass and received them with the menus. The men introduced themselves briefly, and she didn't retain the names because her attention was elsewhere. It was in the way the taller of the two touched Villar's shoulder, in a greeting that lasted a second longer than necessary. It was in the eyes of the other, which swept the hall once before fixing on the table. It was in something she still couldn't name, but that kept buzzing inside her as she walked away to get the appetizers. That night, O Alma Nobre remained the same as always, discreet, elegant, indifferent. But Mariana Luz carried with her back to the service pantry an uneasiness she couldn't shake. Sometimes, danger has no smell, no color, doesn't announce its arrival with any clear sign. Sometimes it simply sits at the table and asks for the wine list with a polite smile, and only those who have learned to see the invisible can feel, before anything else, that this night will not end like the others. The service pantry of O Alma Nobre was a world apart. While the dining room breathed sophistication and calculated silence, the pantry functioned at a frenetic and precise pace, like an engine that no one saw, but that kept everything in motion. It was there that Mariana sought the clarity that the dining room sometimes stole from her. The clattering of dishes, the orders exchanged in low voices between the waiters, the steam escaping from the trays, all of this had an order, a logic that she completely mastered. It was her territory. She assembled the appetizers for table 12 with automatic attention, selected breads, seasoned butter, the sparkling water Villar had requested, and while organizing the items on the tray, she tried to name what was bothering her. She couldn't. It was just that feeling of something out of place, like a wrong note in a song you know by heart. The 2 men had arrived with the kind of rehearsed enthusiasm she recognized in people who were playing a role. It wasn't the normal nervousness of someone about to close a big deal, it was something else. She returned to table 12 with the tray, and served with the discreet efficiency she had perfected over years of practice. The 3 were talking in low tones, and she caught fragments while distributing the breads. Words like restructuring, board, and equity floated in the air with the naturalness of those discussing the weather. Villar listened more than he spoke, which she found interesting. Normally, in the encounters she had witnessed with him, it was the opposite. He dominated the conversation, led the rhythm, defined the parameters. That night, there was something more contained about him, an attention that seemed to mix interest and reserve. The taller of the 2 men, who had very well-combed hair and a watch that Mariana recognized as a brand that cost the equivalent of a few years of her salary, spoke with an enthusiasm that tried to seem spontaneous. The other, shorter and quieter, hardly opened his mouth. He observed. He was the type of presence that would normally go unnoticed, but that Mariana noticed exactly because he was too invisible. No one who was there by chance stayed that quiet. That kind of quiet was a strategy. She asked if they could place their orders or if they preferred a few more minutes. Villar looked up at her for the first time since the other two had arrived, and there was something in that look she didn't expect. It wasn't the usual distracted look. It was direct, almost evaluative, as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. He said they needed a few more minutes. The voice was the same, controlled, but there was a subtle tension in the words that she mentally filed away before moving off. Dinner unfolded at the normal rhythms of Au Alma Nobre during the first hour. Orders were made, dishes were served, glasses were refilled. Mariana divided her attention between table 12 and the other three under her responsibility that night. But table 12 pulled at her perception with an insistence she couldn't ignore. There was something happening there that wasn't on the surface of the conversation. It was felt in the silences that arose when she approached, in the way the quiet man averted his gaze to the tablecloth every time she appeared, in the way the man with the expensive watch leaned slightly forward when he spoke, as if he were leading Villar toward something. It was during the main course that Mariana noticed the first concrete detail. She was approaching to check if they needed anything, when she saw, out of the corner of her eye, the quieter man move near his jacket pocket. The movement was fast, almost imperceptible, his hand going down casually and returning with equal naturalness. She didn't stop. She continued the approach, asked if everything was all right with the dishes, received affirmative answers, and moved away. But she kept what she had seen. In the pantry, while waiting for an order slip from table 8, she processed it. It could have been anything. A cell phone, a wallet, a folded napkin. There was nothing conclusive in it. But there was something. The combination of the discreet movement with the man's calculated posture, with the tension hanging over the table, with that feeling of a wrong note she had carried since their arrival, it all added up to a picture that had no defined shape yet, but that existed. She went back to table 12 to refill the water. As she tilted the bottle over Villar's glass, her eyes swept the table with the speed and precision of someone who spent years training their gaze to capture details without anyone noticing they were capturing anything, and that was when she saw it. Villar's water glass, not the one she was filling, but the second glass, the one that sat slightly to the left of the plate, which had been brought at the start of dinner and was practically untouched, showed a slight cloudiness on the surface of the liquid. Almost nothing. A very subtle film that could be confused with the reflection of the light, with an impurity in the ice, with anything trivial. But Mariana Luz was not just anyone, and that cloudiness was not trivial. She walked away from the table with a regular step, without changing her rhythm, without letting any expression cross her face. She reached the pantry and stood still for a few seconds, both elbows resting on the stainless steel counter, eyes fixed on nothing in front of her. Her heart beat at a rhythm she didn't recognize as her own. There was a part of her that said she was exaggerating, that she was building a narrative out of fragments that might mean nothing. There was another part, deeper, older, that knew that almost imperceptible smell that had reached her nostrils when she leaned over the table. Chemical, strange, familiar in a way that hurt. She closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't the first time in her life that that smell had entered her nose and left a trail. The last time had been years ago, in a completely different context, in a situation she had spent years trying to bury. And that was exactly why she recognized it now, immediate and unequivocal, cutting through all the doubts she might have. There was something in that glass that shouldn't be there, and Gustavo Villar was about to drink it. Mariana straightened up slowly. Around her the pantry continued in its normal rhythm, order slips being exchanged, dishes going out, the chef correcting the plating of something with an impatient gesture. No one noticed what was happening inside her at that moment. No one would ever notice unless she did something. The problem was that doing something had a cost. She knew that with surgical precision. She was a restaurant employee. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't an investigator. She wasn't anyone with the authority to interrupt a business dinner between the president of a billionaire pharmaceutical group and his guests. If she approached the table and said what she thought, she could be dismissed at that very moment. Roberto, the maitre d', would have no doubt in choosing between her and a client like Gustavo Villar, and the men sitting there could simply deny everything, laugh at the exaggeration, make her seem disturbed or ill-intentioned. But there was the other side of that equation. There was what would happen if she did nothing. She turned her back to the counter and looked at the hall through the service window. Part of table 12 could be seen from there, an angle sufficient to notice that the three men were back in conversation and that Villar had his hand around the glass she had identified. There was no time to calculate all the risks. There was only time to decide who she wanted to be at that moment. And Mariana Luz, who had spent 6 years learning to be invisible, realized that invisibility had reached the end of its cycle that night. She took the order pad from her apron pocket, tore off a small sheet, and wrote with the pen she always carried, her handwriting firm despite hands that wanted to tremble. She folded the paper twice, placed it in the palm of her hand, and walked toward table 12 for the last time that night, not yet knowing what those steps would cost or what they would open before her. The note said only, "Don't drink the water. Leave now. Trust me." Mariana reached table 12 with the same expression as always, that face trained in absolute neutrality that she had cultivated like a second skin over the years. She checked the glasses with routine gestures, adjusted the position of a fork that didn't need adjusting, and the moment her hands passed close to Villar's, who had his palm open on the table, fingers relaxed, completely oblivious to what she was carrying, she deposited the folded paper under his fingers with the lightness of someone who had done nothing. She moved away without haste. She didn't run. She didn't look back. Every muscle in her body begged her to speed up, but she knew that any change in rhythm would be noticed, especially by the quiet man who tracked the environment with that disguised attention. She turned the corner of the service corridor and only then let the air out of her lungs all at once, as if she had held her breath for much longer than she had realized. The seconds that followed were the longest of her life inside that restaurant. She stood still in the corridor, back to the wall, eyes closed, counting to 10 as she had learned to do in tense situations. In her head, she built the possible scenarios. Villar would read the note and throw it away, thinking it was some kind of joke or confusion. Villar would read it and get angry, call Roberto, and she would be called to the management office. Villar wouldn't read it, would pick up the glass, and she would have failed anyway. Or, and it was this possibility she needed to be real, Villar would read it, recognize that there was something genuine in those words, and act. When she opened her eyes and allowed herself to walk back to the position from where she could partially see table 12, what she found was Villar, with the paper open in his hand, his face tilted slightly down, reading. The other two hadn't noticed, or, if they did, they didn't show it. There was a window of less than 2 seconds between him finishing the reading and either of them noticing there was something in his hand. Mariana watched this interval with an attention that seemed to suck the air around her. He folded the paper, discreetly returned it to his pocket. He looked up and swept it across the hall with an almost perfect naturalness, but one that Mariana recognized as the naturalness of someone looking for something deliberately. His eyes met hers for less than a second. Less than a second was enough. She didn't move. She just held his gaze. He went back to the conversation, answered something that the other two received with smiles, and then did something she didn't expect. He stood up from the chair with the controlled precision of someone who had made a decision. He said something she couldn't hear from the distance, something that seemed to justify the interruption, and then walked toward the service corridor with regular steps, like someone going to the bathroom between the main course and dessert. She moved to meet him before he reached anywhere where the other two could see. They met in the narrow corridor that led to the back of the restaurant, between the pantry and the men's restroom. Villar turned to her, even before she said anything, and there was an intensity in his eyes that had none of the usual coldness. It was the intensity of someone who had just processed information that changes the ground beneath their feet. He asked in a very low voice who had sent her. She replied that no one had sent her, that she had seen what they did to the glass, that she had recognized something, that she could be wrong, but that she couldn't stay quiet. He was silent for a few moments, eyes fixed on her, evaluating. It was a look she imagined he reserved for meetings where everything was at stake, where the ability to read people in seconds could define the course of an entire negotiation. She let him look, because she had nothing to hide. She was afraid, her heart was beating out of rhythm, and she knew she would probably be looking for a job the next day, but she had done what she did, because she couldn't do otherwise. He asked what exactly she had seen. She described it: the movement of the quiet man's hand, the cloudiness on the surface of the water, the smell that had reached her when she leaned over the table. She described it with the precision of a professional observer, without drama, without exaggeration. As she spoke, she saw something change in his expression. It was subtle, but it was there. A microscopic relaxation in the tension of his jaws that indicated he believed her, or at least that he was taking it seriously enough not to dismiss it. He said, still in a very low voice, that he needed 5 minutes. He asked her to return to the hall and act normally. He said he wasn't going to call Roberto. He said her name as a question, and she answered, Mariana. He repeated the name once, like someone filing away information, and then went back down the corridor with the same controlled steps as when he had left, as if nothing had happened. She stood still for a moment, processing everything, before following back to the hall by the longer path, passing through the pantry, passing the chef who was still correcting platings, passing the other waiters who circulated with trays and didn't have the slightest idea of what was happening 3 meters from them. Back in the hall, she performed her duties with supernatural concentration. She attended table 8, checked table 15, exchanged brief words with the sommelier about a bottle that needed to be opened. Everything with a normalcy that she herself admired, considering that inside she was a chaos of adrenaline and doubt. But when, less than 6 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits she had never seen at O Alma Nobre entered through the main hall and headed with very decided steps toward table 12, and when Gustavo Villar stood up in a way that seemed to suggest he knew exactly who they were, Mariana Luz understood that the 5 minutes had happened while she was serving table 8, and that what came after that moment would no longer fit within the limits she knew. What followed lasted perhaps 3 minutes in total, but it seemed to stretch in a way that distorted time inside the hall. The 2 men in suits positioned themselves with a discretion that was almost elegant, one on each side of table 12, and exchanged brief words with Villar's guests in a tone that allowed no contestation. The 2 men who had arrived for dinner, the one with the expensive watch and the quiet one, responded in distinct ways. The first, with a poorly contained agitation, he tried to disguise as indignation. The second, with that same calculated stillness that had marked his entire presence that night, but now with a rigidity in his shoulders that betrayed his composure. The other customers of O Alma Nobre hardly noticed. That was the primary skill of those men, Mariana understood. They did what they needed to do without creating scenes, without visible disturbances, without giving the restaurant's sophisticated environment any reason to interrupt anyone's dinner. Roberto left the reception, saw what was happening at table 12, and stood still for 3 seconds with that expression of someone who needs to calculate what posture to adopt in the face of something completely outside the usual protocol. After apparently concluding that the best posture was no posture, he returned to the reception with the same measured steps as always. Villar didn't leave immediately. He stood by the table for a moment, observing, with that concentrated expression that had settled on his face since reading the note. Then he turned his gaze to the hall, and Mariana understood he was looking for her. She was standing near table 15, the empty tray resting against the side of her body, and she didn't hide when his gaze found her. There was something different in this eye contact now. It was no longer evaluation. It was recognition. It was the look of someone who had taken the measure of a person and found something they didn't expect. She held his gaze for a second and then looked away, because there were other tables, there was work to be done, and because she didn't yet know what that look would mean when the night ended, and the hall emptied and the reality of everything settled upon her. O Alma Nobre closed at midnight with 20 minutes' notice that night, something that had never happened in the 6 years Mariana had worked there. Roberto gave the information to the remaining customers with that professional smile that invited no questions, claimed a technical unforeseen issue with the air conditioning system, and offered everyone's bill with a 30% discount. People left without complaining, because people who frequent restaurants like that rarely complain about a discount. It is beneath their dignity to seem impressed by saving money. When the last customer left, Roberto called the team for a brief meeting in the hall. Mariana positioned herself between the two younger waiters, Andre and Felipe, who exchanged looks with that anxious curiosity of someone who understood nothing of what had happened that night. Roberto had a stony face in a way she recognized as the mode for transmitting information without transmitting emotion. He said that a situation had occurred at table 12, that the competent authorities were aware, that no one should comment on anything to anyone outside the restaurant, and that everyone would be contacted the following week to provide formal clarifications if necessary. He said this as if he were reading the week's reservation list. Afterwards, when the others began to disperse, he looked directly at Mariana. She held his gaze. He said only, "You can stay for a moment." It wasn't a question. When they were alone in the dimly lit hall, Roberto was silent for a time that she mentally counted in seconds. Then he said, in a voice that had lost all the layer of maitre d' and revealed something closer to a real person, that she had done something very brave or very imprudent, possibly both at the same time, and that he needed to know if she was okay. There was an unexpected kindness in this, coming from a man who spent 12 hours a day being the face of a place that treated people like furniture. She said she was fine. He said it was okay if she wasn't, and that her job was guaranteed, that he had received instructions to that effect. She went home by subway, as always. Line 2 took her from Villa Olympia to Ana Rosa station in 22 minutes on weekdays, and she had made that journey so many times she could do it with her eyes closed. But that night, she kept her eyes open, fixed on the dark window where the reflection of her own face was superimposed on the tunnels passing by. She tried to think clearly, but her thoughts insisted on sinking into places she had locked away a long time ago. The smell. That was what had hit her most strongly in the corridor between the pantry and the bathroom, when she tried to formulate into words what she had seen and felt. The smell she had described to Villar, chemical, strange, with that particular signature that cut underneath everything else in the environment. She knew it because she had smelled it before. She had smelled it on an August afternoon 8 years ago in an analysis laboratory located in a commercial building in Ipiranga, where she had worked for a year and 2 months as an administrative assistant while still trying to resume college. Her older brother, Henrique, had fallen ill at that time. It wasn't a disease with a clear diagnosis, at least not at the beginning. It was a set of diffuse symptoms that doctors attributed to one thing and then another, and which deepened over months in a way that seemed inexplicable for a 41-year-old person with no history of any serious condition. What the doctors found later, after tests that took too long to be requested, was an accumulation of substances in his body that shouldn't be there, substances that had no obvious dietary or environmental origin, substances that, it was finally discovered, were present in a supplement Henrique had taken regularly for almost a year, recommended by a professional who then disappeared from the office, leaving no address. Henrique had survived. Mariana needed to remember this whenever her thoughts went back to that time, because the instinct was to slip into what could have happened instead of fixing on what had actually happened. He was fine today. He had a family, 2 children, lived in Santos, worked at a construction company, but the 2 years that followed the diagnosis, the treatments, the consultations, the debts that accumulated while the family tried to understand what had caused it, those 2 years had changed Mariana in a way she could only see entirely when she allowed herself to look straight at it. She had left the job at the lab. She had left college. She had spent months feeling responsible for not having noticed earlier, for not having made the connection between the supplement and the symptoms sooner, even though there was no rational reason why she should have made that connection. Guilt doesn't need a reason to settle in. It just settles in and starts building rooms. When she joined O Alma Nobre 2 years later, she was just trying to pay the bills. And she stayed because the work had a specific quality she had underestimated before starting. It required absolute attention all the time to everything. There was something almost therapeutic about being forced to live in the immediate present for 12 hours a day. There was no room for the past when you had 6 tables to manage and a demanding customer at table 3 and a wrong dish arriving for table 7. But the past had appeared that night in the smell over the water glass of a man she hardly knew, and she had done the only thing that made sense to do with everything that past had deposited inside her. The apartment Mariana lived in was on the 5th floor of a building without an elevator on Rua Domingos de Moraes. It was 2 rooms she shared with the memory of a life she had planned to be different. There were books everywhere, because books were the only thing she had kept even when there was no money for anything. There was a window that looked out onto a century-old ficus tree on the sidewalk, and she had the habit of staring at that ficus when she needed to think. That night she stood in front of the window for a long time, without turning on the light, watching the ficus illuminated only by the street lamp. She thought of Henrique. She thought of the lab. She thought of Gustavo Villar's face when she had described the smell, and saw something move behind his eyes, not shock, but recognition. As if those words had fitted a final piece into a puzzle he had already been assembling for some time. Something bigger was happening, she felt. Something that went beyond that night in a sophisticated restaurant on Faria Lima. And she, who had spent 6 years becoming invisible, had put her own name at the center of it by signing her gesture with the only thing that was always hers, the fact of paying attention when no one else was. 3 weeks passed without Mariana knowing anything concrete. She returned to work the following Monday, as if the previous Thursday were just one different night in a series of identical nights. She attended the tables, served the glasses, heard the fragments of conversation that were never about what they seemed to be, and kept everything in the usual place, in that mental file she had built over years. Table 12 was empty throughout the first week. In the second week, it received a routine business lunch, and Mariana attended to it without hesitation. Roberto didn't touch on the subject again. There was a quality in his silence that suggested he had received specific instructions about it, and she respected that silence because she knew there were things that were not hers to know, at least not yet. André and Felipe, the younger waiters, circulated with that energy of those who continue waiting for someone to explain what had happened, but no one explained, and eventually they stopped waiting. What Mariana had was time to think. And the more she thought, the more she traveled the same mental path. The quiet man and the smell and the cloudiness and Henrique and the lab and the supplements. The thread connecting these points was invisible, but she felt it with a clarity that didn't diminish with the passing days. There was a logic there that she still couldn't completely articulate, but that existed with the solidity of something real. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon, while she was in the apartment preparing a late lunch. The number was unknown, but she answered because she always answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, direct and professional, who identified herself as Claudia Serrano, assistant to Dr. Gustavo Villar. The woman asked if Mariana could meet with Dr. Villar on Friday afternoon at an office in the Villar Pharma building on Faria Lima, and if there was any impediment to that. The question was phrased in a way that made it very difficult to say there was an impediment. Mariana said she was available. The Villar Pharma building occupied 18 floors of a glass tower, located 3 blocks from O Alma Nobre, which created a geographical strangeness she hadn't anticipated. She had passed that building countless times without ever thinking of it as a place that had anything to do with her. Now she entered through its revolving door with her shoulder bag and the address on her phone as if she had an appointment there, because she did. The 17th floor reception was exactly what she would imagine it to be. Light marble, lighting that made everything seem more serious than it was. A receptionist with the calibrated smile of someone who had undergone specific training for that smile. Claudia Serrano came to fetch her personally, which Mariana interpreted as a sign of something without yet being able to decipher what. Claudia was about 40 years old, with square shoulders and an efficiency in her movements that suggested she didn't waste any gesture. As she led Mariana down the corridor toward a room at the back, she said only that Dr. Villar was waiting, and that if she needed anything before the meeting, she just had to ask. It was the type of functional hospitality that didn't need warmth to be perceived as kindness. The room had an entire glass wall with a view of the Faria Lima axis, and Gustavo Villar was standing when she entered, which she noticed because she didn't expect it. Men in his position normally stayed seated when subordinates entered. The fact that he had stood up said something, even if she didn't yet know exactly what. He greeted her by name, offered water or coffee, and she asked for water because her mouth was dry in a way she recognized as nervousness. They sat in a pair of armchairs near the window, not on opposite sides of a meeting table, and she noticed that this choice also said something. Villar began without preamble. He said he had spent the last 3 weeks discovering what had happened that night, and that what he had discovered was extensive and serious enough that he felt he had an obligation to share part of it with her. He said that the 2 men at the table had acted at the request of a member of Villar Pharma's own board of directors, someone who had convinced themselves that the only way to consolidate a corporate restructuring maneuver that was being contested by Villar was to remove him from the path. Not with direct violence, but with something that looked like a health collapse. Something that, in light of other episodes that the internal investigation had begun to track, was not the first time that person had tried this type of approach. Mariana remained silent while he spoke. It was a lot to process in real time, but she kept every part. Villar then said that, during the investigation, he had asked to pull the complete history of that night's events, and that in speaking with his security team, he had discovered a detail that neither of them had discussed in the corridor of O Alma Nobre. He paused before continuing, and there was something on his face that approached an emotion he clearly wasn't used to showing in work environments. He said that the same investigators who were looking into the case had cross-referenced and found a connection to a case of nutritional supplement contamination that occurred years ago, indirectly linked to a supplier that had had a commercial relationship with a subsidiary of Villar Pharma before his management. A case that had never reached a formal lawsuit, but that had caused real harm to real people. People whose names appeared in a report that had been on his desk for 2 weeks. He said the last name, Luz. He asked if she had a brother named Enrique. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence she had sustained in that meeting room of glass and marble. She looked at the man sitting in front of her and felt the ground beneath her feet move in a way that was not at all metaphorical. It was real, physical, like when you discover that 2 things you thought were completely separate had always been connected by the same thread, and that this thread had crossed years and addresses and jobs and sleepless nights to reach that Friday afternoon on the 17th floor of a building on Faria Lima. She replied that yes, she did. Villar nodded his head once, slowly, like someone closing a circle that took a long time to close. There was a solemnity in that gesture that Mariana didn't expect to find on the face of a man with a reputation for being emotionally inaccessible. He said that there was a responsibility of the company in that episode, not direct, not intentional at the time, but real, and that he intended to honor it. He said there was no way to undo what had happened to Enrique, nor the years she had lost in the process, but that he could act from now on. Mariana kept looking out the window at Faria Lima down there with its cars and its rushes and its buildings, all full of decisions being made. There was an almost dizzying strangeness in being there on that floor in that armchair, having this conversation with this man. She had entered that building as a waitress who had done something she thought was right. She was discovering that she had done much more than that without ever having known. When she finally spoke, her voice came out firmer than she expected. She said she needed time to process all of that there were many things that needed to be understood in order before she could respond to any proposal or initiative he had in mind. Villar said he completely respected that. He said the door was open when she was ready and that Claudia would remain available for any communication. She left the building and walked the 3 blocks back to the subway entrance without stopping, with the dry November wind on her face and the feeling that the world around her continued in its impassive rhythm, while hers had just turned inside out for the 2nd time in 3 weeks. The time Mariana asked to process lasted 2 weeks. During that period, she went to work, did her routes, attended her tables, and inside she built and dismantled the same set of arguments so many times that she came to believe she had spent those 2 weeks literally in circular motion. There was a part of her that mistrusted everything, not Villar specifically, but the situation. The almost scripted perfection of the revelation. The fact that the man she had helped turned out to be indirectly connected to the most painful episode of her adult life was the kind of coincidence that reason automatically placed under suspicion. Coincidences of that size were rarely just coincidences, but there was another part of her, quieter and firmer, that recognized what it recognized. Villar's look when she had described the smell in the restaurant corridor, the way he had stood up when she entered the meeting room, the real solemnity of that nod when she had confirmed Enrique's name. These things were not calculated. She had spent years learning to distinguish what was genuine from what was staged in that environment, and what she had seen on that Friday afternoon had the texture of something true. It was Enrique who helped her decide, as he had done other times in her life. She called him on a Saturday afternoon. They spoke for almost 2 hours, which was unusual for them. They were the type who loved each other in short and frequent conversations, not in long monologues, but she needed to tell everything, and he needed to hear everything, and when she finished, there was a silence on the phone that she knew as the silence of Enrique, thinking seriously before speaking. He said he didn't know what to do with the connection between his case and Villar's company, and that it would probably take time to decide how he felt about it. But he said that what she had done that night in the restaurant was completely consistent with who she had been her whole life, and that if there was an opportunity opening up on the other side of that, he didn't want her to stop taking advantage of it because of something that had happened to him. He was fine. There was a family that needed him and that he needed, and there were whole days when he didn't think about that period. She, on the other hand, had put her own life on hold in a way he had been observing for too long. Mariana was quiet after that. Then she said he was annoying when he was right. He said he knew. She called Claudia Serrano the following Monday. The second meeting on the 17th floor happened without the formality of the first. Villar was more relaxed, or at least the relaxed equivalent for a man who probably didn't know exactly how to relax. There were 2 coffees on the table when she arrived, which she interpreted as a deliberate gesture of naturalness. They sat again in the armchairs near the window. He said there was a proposal he wanted to present, and that it was important to him that she understood there was no obligation on her part, that the proposal didn't change what she had done, nor what he owed her for it, that they were separate things. She said she understood. He said there was a scholarship available, not created specifically for her, but managed by a foundation linked to the company, which funded university education for professionals in a situation of interrupted studies, that the application process was formal and evaluated by an independent commission, and that if she were interested, Claudia could guide her on how to start the process. Mariana listened with attention. Then she asked which course she had left incomplete on her resume, and how he knew. Villar said he had asked for a survey of the public history of candidates who could qualify for the scholarship, that her name had appeared, and that— he stopped here and she noticed the pause— that he had specifically requested they check her situation. There was a transparency in this admission that she appreciated more than anything he could have said instead. She had completed 3.5 years of pharmacy at the University of São Paulo before freezing her enrollment. She had frozen it exactly 6 weeks after Enrique's diagnosis, in a period when it had been impossible to think of anything other than managing the immediate crisis. After the crisis passed, the enrollment had already expired due to inactivity, and resuming seemed to require an energy she didn't have, and then came O Alma Nobre, and the years that O Alma Nobre had consumed in a way that only seemed reasonable when you were inside them. Pharmacy. She had studied pharmacy. There was something circular in that which she needed a moment to sustain emotionally. The same area that had failed her brother was the area she had chosen before anything had happened. She had chosen it because it fascinated her, because the functioning of substances in the organism seemed to her one of the most extraordinary and at the same time most vulnerable things in the world. And it had been exactly this incomplete training that had equipped her to recognize, that night in the restaurant, what no one else around had recognized. Villar was silent while she processed this. He didn't try to fill the silence, which she recorded as a success. There were people who understood that certain moments needed space, and he was one of them, which surprised her coming from a man who had built a reputation for implacability. She said she wanted to know more about the application process, that she wasn't accepting or refusing yet, that she needed to understand the terms before anything else. He nodded and called Claudia with a message on his cell phone. While they waited, the silence between the two was no longer the silence of the previous meeting, loaded with revelations and assimilations. It was a different silence, with a quality closer to two people who still don't know each other well, but who are beginning to understand that they have time for that. He asked in a tone that had moved slightly out of the professional register and into something slightly more direct, if she had always worked in restaurants after she interrupted college, or if she had done other things in between. She said she had worked for a time in an analysis laboratory. He asked which laboratory. And when she said the name, a name that wasn't big or famous, just a commercial laboratory in Ipiranga that probably still existed under another name or no longer existed, she saw, for the second time, that expression on his face. The same movement behind the eyes. The same fitting of a piece. Claudia entered through the door, before either of them could say anything else. But Mariana kept that expression carefully, because there was another connection there that hadn't yet been named, and that she felt would be named soon, and that would change the ground she thought she was stepping on once more. Claudia Serrano was the type of person who made bureaucratic processes seem almost human. She sat beside Mariana in the meeting room and presented the terms of the scholarship at a pace that seemed measured specifically not to intimidate or underestimate, the difficult balance between respect and clarity that few people manage to maintain naturally. The scholarship covered tuition, course materials, and a monthly allowance. The foundation had partnerships with 6 universities in São Paulo, including USP, and there was an application window opening in January. The necessary documents were standard, and Claudia had already printed the list with indications of where each could be obtained. As Claudia spoke, Mariana listened and at the same time observed Villar through her peripheral vision. He had leaned back slightly in the armchair, elbows resting on the arms of the chair, fingers interlaced, with that posture of someone listening without needing to participate actively. But she noticed that he wasn't just present for formality. He was attentive. There was a quality in his attention that she had begun to recognize as his characteristic. The same attention she herself practiced in the restaurant, the ability to capture what was happening on multiple levels at the same time. When Claudia finished, Mariana said she would take the documents and start gathering what was necessary. Then she looked directly at Villar and said there was a question she needed to ask before leaving. He said that was what they were there for. She asked what the laboratory in Ipiranga had to do with all of that. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Claudia looked discreetly at Villar, and Villar looked at Mariana with that expression she had already seen twice, and that she recognized as the visible process of someone deciding how much to say. He said it was a long story. Mariana said she had time. Claudia withdrew with a naturalness that suggested she had been dismissed by some signal Mariana didn't catch, and then there were only the two of them, the armchairs, the window, and Faria Lima down there completely oblivious. Villar said that, before assuming the presidency of Villar Pharma, he had spent 8 years at a multinational pharmaceutical company as operations director. During that period, he had assumed responsibility for a series of acquisitions of smaller suppliers, among them a network of analysis laboratories spread across São Paulo, which the company used for validating raw materials. The laboratory in Ipiranga was one of them. The acquisition had occurred at a time when he was overwhelmed with other responsibilities and had delegated the technical audit to a team that, it was later discovered, had neglected important protocols. Among the problems subsequently found in some of those units were irregularities in the control of substances, irregularities that the company had resolved internally, with compensations paid in secret and agreements that prevented the parties from speaking publicly. He stopped here. There was something on his face that was the executive equivalent of carrying weight. He continued, that only when he had cross-referenced the report on Henrique's case with the history of the units acquired in that period had he found the overlap. The period in which Henrique had been exposed to irregular substances coincided with the period in which that specific laboratory was under the indirect management of the company where he worked. He hadn't known at the time, but that didn't cancel what had happened. Mariana was quiet for a long moment. There were many things inside her asking for space at the same time, and she needed some care not to let any of them dominate before she had processed the full picture. Anger. Yes, there was something of the order of anger there. Not directed specifically at Villar, but at the situation, at the type of world where this type of thing happened and was resolved with secret agreements, while people like Henrique were left with the consequences. There was also something more complicated, harder to name, that had to do with the fact that this man was choosing to be transparent with her when he could easily not be, when no one forced him to, when there was a whole structure of agreements and secrecy that would protect him if he simply said nothing. She asked why he was telling her this. He said there were two reasons. The first was that she had risked her own job and her own safety to warn him that night, and that he didn't see himself in a position to accept that gesture and continue being less than honest with her. The second was that he had reached the conclusion in recent weeks that the type of transparency he had avoided over years, out of pragmatism, out of institutional protection, for all the reasons that seemed reasonable when you were inside the system, had contributed to a culture within and around VR Pharma that had made possible what that board member had tried to do. And that changing that started somewhere. He had decided it started there. Mariana looked at him for a few seconds. Then she said something that came from a place she hadn't planned, that she appreciated the honesty, and that she had decided to trust it for now, and that this didn't mean there weren't things to be resolved with more time, but that she could work with for now. He said it was enough. She left the building that afternoon with the scholarship documents in her bag, and a feeling she took a while to identify. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something more like the feeling of being in motion after a long period standing still. That specific combination of energy and vulnerability you feel when you start moving towards something that matters before you're sure you'll get there. She stopped on the sidewalk in front of the building and looked up at the glass tower reflecting a slightly cloudy November sky. There was something that needed to be resolved before anything else. There was a call she needed to make. She called Henrique. He answered on the second ring. She said there was something he needed to know and that it was complicated, and she asked him to listen to the end before reacting. He said, okay. She told everything she had learned about the lab, about the chain of responsibilities, about what Villar had said. There was a long silence after she finished. Henrique said finally that he needed time with that it was too much for a phone call. Mariana said she knew, and that there was no hurry and that she was there when he wanted to talk. He said yes. And then, after another smaller silence, he said that she had done right in telling him, and that he was proud of her. Not for the restaurant, not for the note, not for what had happened with Villar, but for the way she had lived all those years without letting what had happened make her smaller. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone still to her ear for a few seconds after he hung up. The traffic on Faria Lima passed without haste or urgency around her, and the dry November wind smelled of the city, and she thought there was something in that moment, at that specific point between a chapter that was ending and another that still had no shape, that was worth feeling in its entirety, without shortcuts. January arrived with that climatic brutality that São Paulo sometimes practiced, dry heat during the day and short violent storms in the late afternoon that washed the sidewalks and left the air for 30 minutes with a different quality, almost transparent, before everything returned to normal. It was the type of month Mariana had always associated with transitions, not for any particularly logical reason, but because it was when the new year still felt real, before routine absorbed it back into the shape that previous years had left. She handed in the scholarship application documents in the second week of January. The process had been simpler than she expected, perhaps because Claudia Serrano had shown herself available at every stage with a precision that eliminated any obstacle before it became a real obstacle. It had been strange at first to accept this kind of practical help from someone linked to Villar, but she had reached the conclusion that refusing help out of principle when the help was genuine and necessary was a type of pride that served no one. She had given notice at O Alma Nobre in December. Roberto had received the news with the same face he received all news, neutral on the surface, and with something moving underneath that he chose not to show. He said she had been the best employee that restaurant had had in 10 years, and he said it the way he said everything, without drama, directly, as if it were just one more factual piece of data. She thanked him, because it's the type of thing you thank when someone says it the right way. The younger waiters, André and Felipe, made a small surprise in the last week of work. They bought a cake from a bakery in Villa Olympia and put a strip of colored paper in the pantry that said, with the irregular handwriting of someone who had done it in a hurry, "Good luck, Mariana." She had stood looking at that banner for a moment longer than necessary, because there was something in it, in the simplicity of the gesture, in the slightly crooked colored paper, in the bakery cake served among stainless steel trays, that summarized something about that place she couldn't put into words but was going to take with her. The last night at O Alma Nobre, she did with total attention, every table, every glass, every detail, the same way she had done for 6 years. At the end, she walked through the empty hall one last time, with the same intention she walked it before opening, feeling the silence of that space that had been for a long time, the structure around which the rest of her life was organized. There was gratitude in that, she discovered. Not longing yet, longing would come later, with more texture, but genuine gratitude for a place that had given her what it had given her, that had been the space where she had become who she was on that night in November. Classes began in March. She had been approved in the USP selection process for re-enrollment, and the scholarship had been confirmed in writing in February. The pharmacy course, which had been suspended in the 3.5 year, would resume from the semester following the one she had interrupted, which meant there was a curriculum to be studied, new professors, colleagues who would be 10 years younger, and a quantity of things to be relearned and learned for the first time that she had turned into a list on the apartment wall. In February, Villa called her directly. It wasn't Claudia who called this time, and she noticed that. It was a Saturday morning, and she was having coffee by the window looking out at the ficus in the street. He asked if she was well, how things were, and there was a quality in his voice different from the meetings, less structured, closer to a conversation. She said she was fine, that things were moving. He said there was something he wanted to say, and that he had been waiting for the right moment, but that he had realized that right moments sometimes don't appear if you don't create them. He said that during the internal investigation that had unfolded since November, he had found evidence of irregularities dating back to decisions made before his management, but involving people who were still in the company's structure. That movements were being made to hold those people adequately accountable, and that the process would be long and would face resistance, but that he had decided he was no longer willing to manage the company the way he had managed it until then, prioritizing the appearance of solidity over the reality of processes and institutional protection over individual responsibility. That what had happened in November had been a turning point, not just for the attempt itself, but for what the investigation had revealed about the environment that had made it possible. Mariana heard all this sitting by the window, with the coffee cooling in her hand. When he finished, she said she appreciated him telling her that it wasn't an obligation, and that she recognized the difference. There was a pause, and then he asked if she would accept having dinner with him once, in a place completely different from O Alma Nobre, when she was established in the semester, and when things were a bit less turbulent. He said there was an important distinction between what he was offering as institutional recognition and what he was asking now, and that he wanted her to know they were separate things and that one didn't depend on the other. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ficus, which the February wind moved slightly. There was a specific irony in being invited to dinner by a man she had served for years in a restaurant, and she felt it clearly enough to almost smile. She said yes. That when things were a bit less turbulent. He said he would be waiting. The voice had something different at that moment, less controlled than usual, with a quality closer to someone who was genuinely waiting for something, instead of just waiting for the next item on the agenda. She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand for an instant, looking at the ceiling of the apartment, feeling the simultaneous weight and lightness of a period that was ending and of another that was about to begin. There was one thing she had learned, throughout all those years of silent observation, that the stories that change life rarely announce the moment they do so. They arrive as ordinary nights, as routine dinners, as well-dressed men who sit at table 12 in a sophisticated restaurant on a Thursday in November. And later, at some point between the smell over a glass of water and a call on a Saturday morning, you realize the ground has moved and you are in another place, and that this other place, for all its uncertainty, has the shape of something you had forgotten could exist. She let the coffee cool completely and continued looking at the ficus on the sidewalk, which continued there, old and impassive and absolutely indifferent to anything happening around it, as it had always been, and as it would continue to be. There was something comforting in that. The world that stops for nothing continues to be the same world that offers space from time to time for people who pay enough attention to rebuild what they thought they had lost forever. 2 years later, O Alma Nobre still existed. Mariana passed by it on an April afternoon, on her way to a practical class in the USP laboratory, and stopped for a moment on the sidewalk looking at the polished bronze facade that remained exactly as it had been for 6 years. The plaque, the amber lighting, the revolving door she had pushed hundreds of times without ever thinking she was entering or leaving a phase of life. It was strange how places stayed the same while people changed around them. There was something almost philosophical in that which she kept to think about later, when she had time, which was a condition that college had made simultaneously more frequent and rarer. The second year of pharmacy was harder than the first had been, not because the content was denser, although it was, but because she was doing things in a different way now. There was urgency, where before there was only obligation. There was real curiosity, where before there was technical competence. The difference between studying something because you have to and studying something because you understand exactly why you have to is the difference between traveling a path and building it. Her classmates were, for the most part, 10 years younger than she, which had created, in the first months, a kind of mutual social estrangement that she had navigated with the patience of someone who spent years learning to coexist with people completely different from herself. Over time, the age differences had transformed into something more interesting. She brought perspective, they brought energy, and there were specific encounters in that middle ground where the two things fed each other in a genuinely productive way. Henrique had come to São Paulo twice during that period. On the second visit, he had asked to pass by the VR Pharma building, not to enter, just to see. The two of them stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, looking at the glass tower reflecting a heavy August sky, and didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, and there was a peace in that shared silence that Mariana recognized as the type of thing that only exists between people who have gone through something together and reached the other side with the relationship intact. The dinner with Gustavo Villar had happened in August of the first year, when things, as promised, were a bit less turbulent. He had chosen a place completely different from O Alma Nobre, a small restaurant in Pinheiros, with light wood tables and dishes written on a blackboard, the type of place where no one would expect to find the president of a billionaire pharmaceutical group on a Thursday night. She had found that a success. The conversation had been different from all the others they had had. No meeting structure, no Claudia Serrano by his side, no window to Faria Lima creating the official setting for everything. They were two adults in a restaurant with light wood tables, learning what lay beyond the versions of each other they knew until then. She had discovered he had humor, hidden under layers of formality, but present. That he had read more fiction than she would expect from someone with that history. That there was a story behind the coldness people associated with him, as there was a story behind everything in everyone, and that this story was more complicated and more human than the public image suggested. He had discovered she was funnier than she seemed, that she had very concrete opinions on very specific things, and that there was a precision in the way she observed the world that fascinated him in a way he was still trying to articulate. They had stayed 3 hours in that restaurant, and when they left, the Pinheiro street was in that weekday night movement that has a specific quality, people coming and going with purpose and without purpose, and there was something in the walk to the cars that had the texture of a beginning. That was exactly what it was. A beginning. In the months that followed, the two had learned to get to know each other at the pace circumstances allowed, which was not slow, but neither was it rushed. And there was something healthy in that rhythm that both recognized without needing to name it. There were real differences between them, of context, of world, of habits built over decades in completely distinct environments. And those differences didn't disappear just because there was attraction and respect. But there was also something that revealed itself with consistency in every conversation, every dinner, every Saturday afternoon that occasionally included a walk through Ibirapuera Park or a movie in a street cinema. that both were fundamentally people who paid attention, to different forms of attention with different tools, but with the same conviction that what was beneath the surface of things was always more important than what appeared on top. On the April afternoon when she passed in front of O Alma Nobre, Mariana stood for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the facade before continuing to walk. There was a class waiting for her and a laboratory report to be handed in the following week, and there was a message from Villa on the phone that she hadn't yet opened, probably about Saturday's dinner. And there was Henrique, who had called in the morning asking for advice on something related to his children, who were now old enough to create situations that required advice. There was, in short, a life with shape and weight and direction, not perfect, not resolved in all its aspects, but alive in a way she had stopped taking for granted. Sometimes when she was in the college laboratory, and the specific smell of substances reached her with that characteristic quality that no other thing in the world has, she thought of that November night. She thought of the water glass, with that almost imperceptible cloudiness. She thought of the piece of paper torn from the order pad and the words she had written with the pen she always carried. She thought of the regular steps back to the hall after having deposited that note, pretending she had done nothing when she had done everything. There was no heroism in that, she had concluded. There was only the silent accumulation of everything that had formed her. The brother, the laboratory, the years of college, the 6 years of observation in a sophisticated restaurant where no one saw her, converging into a single point of decision that lasted less than a minute and that had changed the trajectory of at least 2 lives in ways that were still revealing themselves. The city continued around her as she walked toward the subway, with its rushes and its buildings and its glorious indifference to anything other than its own perpetual motion. And Mariana Luz walked within it no longer as someone who had learned to be invisible, but as someone who had finally and entirely understood that invisibility had never been a destination. It had been only the waiting room. End of story. If this story touched your heart, you are not alone. Stories like Mariana's exist around us every day, in people who observe in silence, who carry pasts that shape them without anyone seeing, who act at the right moment because all of life prepared them for that instant. If you've come this far, it's because you know how to recognize when a story is worth every second. So do one simple thing. Subscribe to the channel now, because there is much more waiting for you. Leave your like. It tells the universe that stories like this deserve to exist.